Okay, we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jorge Piedrahita, and on behalf of Copernico Capital Partners, let me welcome all our clients and friends to this informational seminar. Copernico is an asset manager regulated by the Central Bank of Uruguay. Before we get started, I have a brief disclaimer to read. The information provided in this seminar shall not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of any offer to buy interest in any securities or private fund that is or may be managed by or sponsored by Copernico Capital Partners. The information provided herein is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment or legal advice. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates discussed might be forward-looking and based upon certain assumptions. Any projections, outlooks, or assumptions should not be construed to be indicative of the actual events which will occur. The information and opinions here discussed may change or be modified at any time without further notice. This event is called Venezuela, a New Beginning, Economy, Sanctions, Geopolitics, and Elections. The topics, we believe, are very timely given the events on the ground. Having said that, let me briefly introduce the presenters. Both of them are well known to this large audience, and it's a pleasure for me to have both of them here. Francisco Rodriguez is a professor of practice in public and international affairs at the Joseph Corbel International Studies, University of Denver. He is a well-known Venezuelan economist and founder of Petróleo for Venezuela, a not-for-profit organization. He holds a master's degree and a doctorate in economics from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in economics from Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. Francisco has written several books and numerous articles on the subject of Venezuela in all major publications around the world, and he is well known to all of us. José Ignacio Hernández is a law professor at the Andrés Bello Catholic University and the Central University of Venezuela, and a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. He is presently a senior specialist at Aurora Macro Strategies based in New York City. He is a lawyer and has a PhD in administrative law. He has published numerous books and articles in the US, Europe, and Venezuela. Now, for this webinar, let me describe what we're going to do. The event will start with a few questions. I will ask Jose Ignacio and Francisco, and then we will open the floor to questions from the attendees. Please ask your questions through the chat box in the Zoom application. Let's start, please, Jose Ignacio, with the topic of sanctions. There have been recently several changes to the sanctions regime imposed by OFAC, which is an office that reports to the US Treasury. What have those changes been in general terms, and are we in front of a new regime? What should we expect going forward? Go ahead, Jose Ignacio.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Jorge, for the invitation. It is quite a pleasure to be here together with Francisco. There has been indeed many changes in the United States sanctions policy towards Venezuela. And as we all know, the main change began in 2022 with the Chevron license that authorized Chevron to conduct production and commercialization activities in the United States. And then came the limited but broad General License 44 that for 6 months suspended all the prohibitions regarding PDVSA. However, the practical effects of that license was very limited, among many other consequences, due to the problems regarding the legal representation of PDVSA in the United States. But in any case, General License 44 expires as a result of the violation of the Barbados Agreement by the Maduro's government, as was stated by the United States government. And now we have a sort of individual license policy that, although there is not a formal guidelines, I understand that there are 2 conditions that OFAC are considering to issue those individual licenses. First, only firms that have actual investment in the oil and gas sector in Venezuela could receive such a license. And second, OFAC is giving preference to creditors of PDVSA, basically to reduce the cash flow to the Maduro's government. There are few public information in that sense, but however, I finished a report on that. I am looking here my notes to identify what companies has so far obtained such a license. We have Maurel and Prom, Repsol, and regarding the gas project, BP and NGC. It's not too much, to be honest. There are other firms waiting for license regarding production and export activities. There are other cases such as Reliance, more focused on commercialization. And I will finish my brief commentary with another reflection. That is that this new sanction policy has promoting private investment in the oil sector, the Venezuela oil sector. That is a good news. But however, because the current hydrocarbons regulation framework has not been modified, PDVSA has applied, which I consider is a very fragile and dubious solution, which is creating a sort of oil contract, a special contract, share production contracts that basically allows private investment to conduct oil activities not based on the formal hydrocarbons regulations in Venezuela, but in the so-called anti-blockade law. And it is unclear that such a fragile framework could promote the recovery of the oil industry beyond, of course, problems related with sanctions.
Thank you very much, Jose Ignacio. Now, Francisco, turning to you on the subject of sanctions, there has been a change, and I guess one of the questions is how would this change affect your prognosis for the Venezuelan economy, oil production, and so on, but also what's your overall view on these changes and the sanctions regime in general, Francisco?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jorge. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Jose Ignacio, having this opportunity to discuss about the perspectives for the Venezuelan economy. So let me start out first with a broad overview of how I view Venezuela sanctions. There is, as many of you know, a broad literature on both the effect and the effectiveness of sanctions. And generally, this literature finds relatively limited effectiveness of sanctions. There's a landmark study that puts their effectiveness at 34%. There are some others that claim that the number is lower. Actually, not that many that claim that it's higher. But in general, some of the lessons that come out of that literature is that the effectiveness of sanctions tends to be limited to certain cases. And those cases are, for example, when the objectives are also limited. So they don't work well with very ambitious objectives. They tend to work better when the sanctioned governments are democracies, not when there are autocracies. And they tend to work better when there's not an antagonistic relationship between the sanctioner and the sanctioned previous to the sanctions. And of course, none of those conditions imply in Venezuela it's an authoritarian regime. The sanctions are very ambitious in goals, and it's a regime that had an antagonistic relationship with the U.S. Prior to the sanctions. So in that sense, the fact that sanctions do not appear to have led to a change in the political outcomes in Venezuela is not surprising. Of course, as with any causal statement, there's always room for debate, and there are people who hold to the position that things would be even worse if it were not for sanctions, or that the opposition's limited bargaining power has to do with sanctions. This type of causal questions are in particular incidents and particular cases difficult to answer in a decisive way. But what we do know is that we have not had the evolution of Venezuela towards a democratic transition yet that the advocates of sanctions would have hoped. On the other hand, we do have significant evidence that they have had an effect, an adverse effect on the Venezuelan economy, and particularly on the oil sector. Obviously, this does not mean in any way that they're the only cause of the problems in the oil sector, but there's literature that has accumulated, and have a book that's coming out with University of Notre Dame Press in the spring of next year called The Collapse of Venezuela, Scorched Earth Politics and Economic Decline, that reviews all of the evidence and comes out with a range of estimates that indicate a pretty significant effect. Now, if the sanctions, and going to your question of what does this mean for the economy, if the sanctions had a significant negative effect on oil production, and more generally, they work by severing the links between Venezuela and the global economy, both in terms of oil markets and in terms of financial markets. Will their lifting lead to a recovery in Venezuela? And I think that the answer is to a limited extent, they will contribute. I mean, in the sense that economic growth without sanctions is likely to be higher than with sanctions. And I think that we've seen that, for example, in the contribution of the growth in Chevron oil production to Venezuela's positive growth over the course of the past few years. Venezuelan GDP, for those of you that haven't followed it that closely, essentially hit bottom GDP per capita in 2020, and it's been recovering for the past several years. But on the other hand, we do have several limitations, and of course, one of the main ones has to do with the fact that, as José Ignacio mentioned, this easing of sanctions is extremely limited. It's been stop and go. It's been conditioned on political developments where the same fact that you're not getting an openness of a Maduro government to democratic reforms, if anything, the Maduro government is continuing in its authoritarian conduct. It basically makes it not surprising that we're having this scenario of sanctions being rolled back, and therefore we don't seem to have like a decisive opening or lifting of sanctions that would be necessary to have a significant effect. That said, the Venezuelan experience, I think, resembles that of many sanctioned countries, and Iran is actually a good example, I think, where Iran was hit with U.S. oil sanctions in 1979 at the time of
We had a little bit of a technical glitch. Francisco, there
was a gradual recovery. Oops, sorry. So is my connection unstable again?
We missed you for about 10 seconds.
Okay. Well, if that happens again, I'll connect through another. Sorry. So I was pointing to the oil sanctions in 1979 and U.S. economic sanctions, and what happens with these countries is that they adapt over time to the sanctions regime, and I think that there's even more scope to do that when you have partners right now like Russia, like China, like the same Iran. So what you see is that the economy becomes somewhat more resilient to sanctions over time. I don't want to talk for too long, but I just want to close by saying that it's difficult to understand in the Biden administration's logic whether their easing of sanctions has been strategic or opportunistic, because I think that sometimes they claim that it's strategic, such as they claim that the Trump administration was doing maximum pressure and that they want to use this lifting of sanctions, or this easing of sanctions, to bring about concessions from the regime. If that's the aim, I'm not surprised that they're not working, that they're not eliciting those concessions. Now, at other times, it appears as if, even though that's what they say publicly, the reality is that they're more interested in reintegrating Venezuela into global markets, because they believe that it will have an effect on oil supply, and that they believe that it will attenuate migration to the United States. And to the extent that that's the rationale, then I would expect that we are going to continue to see this type of limited easing, and for the individual licenses, to be used as to carry that out within a context where it's not really that visible that there's an opening, but still that is the primary aim of policy.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francisco. Now, let's turn our attention for a couple of minutes to the issue of Citgo. Citgo, as most of you may know, the entity that is going to be auctioned is PDVSA Holdings. That entity is owner of Citgo Holdings, which in turn controls Citgo and the refineries. Now, we know that the auction process requires previous authorization from OFAC in order to be able to transfer the shares of PDVSA Holdings. That action would end PDVSA's control of Citgo, which it has held for more than 30 years. So in that sense, Jose Ignacio, what is the latest and what can be expected? Is there a political motivation on part of the US to extend the asset protection from OFAC and maybe make things easier in the campaign trail for the opposition in Venezuela? We do know that Maduro is making the loss of Citgo a campaign theme.
Well, that's a great question. Indeed, very hard to answer in 2 minutes. But I will say that in a strict technical perspective, the United States doesn't have to extend the protection over Citgo. Citgo is already protected as a result of sanctions. I'm going to explain this later. What could change the destiny of this case is a change in the United States policy towards Citgo in a more proactive way to protect Citgo as an strategical objective of the Venezuelan transition. But I think that this is a long shot under the current circumstances. Where are the current situation of the Delaware cases? As we all know, between today and June 17th, the special master will receive, consider, and eventually select the best offer for the PDV holding shares. We consider that there is a high probability that the special master decided to take 2 more weeks to try to improve the value of PDV holding shares. There are too many issues at stakes, including the 2020s that are currently one of the major problems to solve in that case. And after that, on July 15, I will say that this is the only date that is relatively safe. Delaware court will conduct the auction hearing to consider the report by the special master to decide any objections. I am not expecting any decision that day, so nothing is going to happen on July 15. There is a sort of countdown, with this date, but nothing is going to happen. This is a very complex case from a legal perspective, and I am expecting that Delaware court will take between 1 and 2 months to take a final decision, let's say September, and after that, there's going to be an appeal by the Venezuelan parties, an appeal by creditors that will not be able to collect their claims, and the appeal before the Third Circuit will take 6 months if the Third Circuit decided to conduct an expedite process, which means that this case will be still pending, let's say in March 2025, with 2 presidential elections in the meantime, Venezuela and then the United States. So in terms of transfers, the PDV holding shares, there is no imminent risk in the case, because only when there is a final decision, only then OFAC will consider whether to grant or not a license. And as I explained, this could be approximately March 2025 at the earliest. Regarding the United States policy towards Citgo, I have been very critical on that policy. I consider that there is a big contradiction between the effort of the United States to support democracy in Venezuela and what happened in 2023. That was a major change in the United States policy that, however, was not too analyzed in the media. What happened? In April 2023, the United States government changed the policy established back in 2019 to consider that now Citgo is not strategic regarding the policies toward Venezuela. And as a result, OFAC decided to grant a license to Delaware court to issue writ of attachment and to collaborate, actively collaborate in the action sale process, meaning that the United States government is facilitating the action sale process, and it already established that OFAC will adopt a favorable licensing policy once there is a final judgment by the Delaware court. Why the United States changed this policy? It's hard to understand the reasons, but personally, I consider that there are two main reasons why the United States changed this policy. First, it was this environment of the failure of the maximum pressure policy, and as a result, sanction easing came with the reduction of the CITGO protections. You cannot have a flexibilization in sanctions plus protection with regarding CITGO. The only protection that currently exists regarding CITGO derives from the executive orders that sanctions PDVSA and its affiliates. And the other reason, in my opinion, was the disbandment of the interim government. I published a piece in CSIS at the beginning of last year, I think, prior to the change of United States policy, and I anticipated that because there was no interim government, there was no real government of Venezuela recognizing the United States, the level of protection regarding CITGO will be lower, and regrettably, that is what's happening. Can the United States change its policy and return to 2019? I think that this is a long shot, to be absolutely honest. There is a strong principle in the United States Treasury according to which sovereign have to pay their debts. The Delaware court has been insisting that PDVSA and Venezuela has to pay their debt. And it is very hard to consider or imagine a change in policy without a clear plan to deal with the pending claims at Delaware and, generally speaking, the debt, the external debt. But so far, it is unclear the capability of the National Assembly, 2015 National Assembly, to prepare and present that plan because, and I will stop here, until January the 5th, 2025, that is a very important date. Until that day, the government of Venezuela will be represented in the United States by the 2015 National Assembly, meaning that only that National Assembly, with the new institutional framework adopted in 2023, could exert the right of a sovereign state to try to change the United States policy, but so far, there has been no formal attempt in that direction.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jose Ignacio. Francisco, to you about the same question about your thoughts about this, but also I do know that you have several times realized or provided some valuations for CITGO and what it should be worth. And I also would like to hear your thoughts on the evaluations. We have heard that the different bidders may be posing and what you think the value is and, what can be done to enhance that value, but also your overall comment about, the whole process as well. Go ahead, Francisco, please.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And let me start with that. We have done some estimates without entering into the technical details, but welcome to forward the details of our publications. And in fact, in a report published by Oil for Venezuela, called Cooperative Responses to Venezuela's Crisis that I authored jointly with Giancarlo Bravo and Guillermo Guerrero, we do put some estimates of CITGO valuation, which put it at around $12 to $13 billion. However, the bids at the auction are coming in way lower than that, and will probably, when all is said and done, coming way lower than that. And this illustrates. We don't think that it's that means that our valuation is wrong, but I do think that it illustrates the weight that legal uncertainties and the uncertainty about the enforcement of property rights actually have on this issue. The reality is that somebody who decides to bid for Citgo at this moment, or more precisely for PV Holding, is entering into a very uncertain process where, as we saw in the bipartisan letter that was circulated last week, there's significant support for some actions from the U.S. government to stop that bid. So it ends up actually, interestingly, I mean, that process actually ends up being like almost worse for everybody, because then Citgo might end up being sold at a very low price, and therefore just a smaller fraction of Venezuela's debts that could have been paid with that will be paid, which means that Venezuela won't address even the part of the problem that it could have addressed with the sale. Now, all of that said, I think that, in my view, Citgo is lost. I don't think that I don't see a scenario, a reasonable scenario, or at least a high probability one, in which Venezuela is going to maintain ownership of the firm. The liabilities that have accumulated with the legal rights to attach the shares of PV Holding just far outweigh the value of the firm. And really, from a legal standpoint, what the U.S. can do is just retard that process. What the U.S. can do is delay it by not giving the license, but the U.S. Cannot erase those claims. And what that means is that when the sanctions come to an end, if they come to an end, then or when the license is given, then those claims operate. So it's not like the U.S. can't just say, oh, I'm going to use my authority and I'm going to give this back to the government of Venezuela, even if it's the legitimate government of Venezuela. So if Edmundo Gonzalez comes into the presidency and sanctions are lifted, creditors will have their legal right, and the U.S. In my view, has or I'll make a caveat here, and I'd love to also hear Jose Ignacio's legal opinion on this. I don't think that it has many ways of impeding that. Now, there is a scenario, and the fact that Citgo was put into the Barbados agreements, there's a scenario that some of us have visualized and talked about, which is the possibility that a legitimate government in Venezuela, or an agreement between the parts, which would also count with international legitimacy, might be able to engage creditors, and the U.S. could use its ability to stop the sale as a way to incentivize that negotiation. And there is a sense in which, yes, I mean, if the U.S. says to creditors, I'm not going to grant this license unless you reach a deal with the Venezuelan government, that's kind of an offer that you can't refuse. But we would have to be in a setting like that, and we haven't seen that be born out of negotiations. I mean, it was put on paper in the Barbados agreement, but it was not done. So we'd really have to visualize another scenario in which very soon we get a legitimate, recognized government in Venezuela in place, and we can discuss that when we turn to the political scenarios. Now, I also want to tackle this question that Jose Ignacio posed, which is the issue of why did the U.S. change this policy? And the way that I see it is, I think that the U.S. returned to its normal policy, that is the policy that one should have expected in the case of a country like Venezuela. And what I think was abnormal was the very high priority that Venezuela had as a foreign policy during the Trump administration, particularly in the attempt to impose regime. Remember, Jorge, when we were in Torino, we saw one of the reports that I wrote actually counted all the tweets of high-ranking government officials from the U.S. About Venezuela and about other issues, and basically counted that there was a period in January and February of 2019, and in which, if you looked at like Pence, Bolton, the figures, 50% of their tweets were on Venezuela. So it was like the level of priority it was given to Venezuela was something that I don't think we're going back there. And I think that once you're no longer at that level of priority, then basically the decision to stop the Citgo sale from the standpoint of the U.S. government, there's really two considerations. One of them is the U.S. government believes that part of its policy should be to enforce contracts, and enforcing contract means that if a creditor doesn't pay, then if a debtor doesn't pay, then creditors have a right to go after its assets, that security and the enforcement of property rights is part of what establishes the U.S. as a global financial center. But that can be trumped, no pun intended, by foreign policy goals. So the reasoning that the U.S. imposed during the Trump administration was, look, we have an overriding policy objective, which is to generate regime change in Venezuela. So these issues of the enforcement of contracts in this particular case are going to take a back seat to that. Now, I think that as we moved into the Biden administration, and as the efforts for regime change receded, or the prospects of regime change receded in Venezuela, then the enforcement of contracts part started having priority, and the foreign policy goal with respect to Venezuela was no longer so overriding. Is it possible that you could get some action to delay the sale? Certainly before to avoid, notwithstanding José Ignacio's very valid points about the timing, to avoid something that would give a victory, symbolic victory to the Maduro government before the elections. You might get that because we are at a moment in which there is all of a sudden a lot of expectation about the possibility of regime change in Venezuela. Now, whether that's going to continue beyond July 28th is something that I guess we can touch upon when we get to the political scenarios.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francisco. And that's a great transition into the next issue, which is what should we expect in the next few months. Whether we should assume or not, if there is a political transition, what are the different scenarios that each of you may have, and whether it's a short or a long transition, or maybe there is no transition for the time being, but also what needs to happen the day after in Venezuela? How should we think about the set of laws that need to change, the reorganization of the government, the territory of Venezuela, the armed forces, anything that you want to comment on that? And I'll ask Jose Ignacio to get started on that, and then Francisco, which I know has studied this in deep detail. Jose Ignacio, please.
Yeah, great. Just a brief commentary about Francisco's opinion. There is a case that I have been analyzing, that is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was able to obtain a stay before the Southern District Court of New York, supported by the United States government, which is not a common way of the United States government to act. That was last year, October, November 2023. And the main reason was that Sri Lanka has a credible plan to deal with the debt. So once again, I think that any possibility for an efficient solution back in Delaware will require a credible plan by the government of Venezuela, whatever the government of Venezuela is. Now, turning into your question, Jorge, the first condition to think in a transition in Venezuela is that as a result of the elections, there should be a legitimate government, meaning a government elected in a non-contentious election. And this is a hard objective to achieve under the current conditions. There are already electoral malpractices, systematic human rights violations, and in short word, systematic violation of the electoral integrity conditions regarding the election schedule for July 28 to avoid that the result of that election, if the result favored Maduro, will be considered free and fair. Indeed, from a technical perspective, the Venezuelan presidential elections are not and will not be free and fair. The amount of the violations already committed are sufficiently grave to dramatically hinder the credibility of the election. This is why, as I have explained in some pieces at CSIS, I think that the objective is not to have free and fair elections, simply it's impossible, but is to have a non-contentious election. And can Maduro be reelected in a scenario in which the elections are not contentious? I think that is very hard. from a practical perspective, meaning that the only possibility to have a non-contentious election is to have an electoral proclamation of Edmundo González or any other candidate from the opposition. So what Venezuela really needs for January the 10th, 2025, when the new presidential term will begin, is a legitimate government. Legitimate meaning a government that was elected in a non-contentious election. That is, once again, a hard bar to achieve. If that objective is achieved, and that will be, of course, a great news, the first constraint that the government will have to achieve is the lack of a capable state. I have been explaining that the binding constraint for economic growth and development in Venezuela currently is not the lack of rule of law or the autocratic institutions in place, is the lack of a capable government, state fragility. Good news here, by the way, and I finished a short paper on that, is that the International Monetary Fund finally approved a new strategy regarding fragile state and conflict-affected situations. This is a program that I have been closely following. And Venezuela has been considered for 2 consecutive years by the IMF as a fragile state, meaning that Venezuela could have access to a special program by the IMF focused on building institutions and building capabilities. So building a capable state should be the first condition. And then, of course, restoring the economic rights, restoring the institutions of the market economy. Second, in terms of institutional reforms, I think that is highly necessary a new hydrocarbon regulations in Venezuela. Back in 2018 at Harvard, I prepared a model of new hydrocarbons law. I have also proposed a more specific reform to the current oil regulations, but the only way, a necessary condition, to promote the recovery of the oil industry in Venezuela is with new institutions in place. Thinking in the recovery of the oil industry in Venezuela with the anti-blockade law and this, what I have called de facto privatization of the oil industry, is simply not an option. And after that, on third place, of course, debt restructuring is a necessary condition to promote the economic recovery. And I will end my considerations with a topic that I have been insisting in the recent weeks, which is the necessity of a transitional framework for Venezuela. Venezuela needs a comprehensive transitional justice system, not only focused on the political dimension of the transitional justice, but also including the economic transition from this increasing informality in the economy, this de facto privatization, through a formal market institutions model. We need, of course, all the oil companies. Venezuela needs all the oil companies such as Chevron, Maurel, and Prom that have been able to resume activities based on a very fragile regulatory framework. But we need to create, Venezuela needs to establish a transition between this informal economy and a formal and inclusive economy. So I will say, and I will stop here, that if you ask me, the 2 main challenges of a new government in Venezuela are going to be building state capabilities and promoting a credible transitional justice system. That is a pending topic in Venezuela. And by the way, I have been commenting on the proposal by President Petro, endorsed among others by President Lula and President Boric, about a political agreement in Venezuela towards a transitional justice. And this is unnecessarily a step that should be adopted at the earliest convenience.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Ignacio. Francisco, following on the subject of the day after and what needs to happen and the different paths, and I'm very interested on hearing your thoughts on that and also what your projections are. I do remember back in 2015 when we were together at Torino, you were the only analyst that raised the serious possibility that the 2015 National Assembly. In that election, the opposition could have a qualified majority, and that is exactly what happened. So with that in mind, please, let us know your thoughts.
Okay, well, great. Wonderful. And thanks for reminding me of that. I did make that forecast actually while I was still at Bank of America in 2015. But definitely I remember our talking about it. And now the thing is that it's, over time, it's become very difficult to make electoral forecasts in Venezuela because what we've seen is that the predictive power of polls has actually declined significantly. So just to give you one example, a recent one, which is that in 2021, a prominent polling company, I won't mention it just, not so that it doesn't look like I'm putting any particular polling company on the spot, but let's say it's one of the most prominent, well-known ones, said that 48% of voters indicated that they would vote either for opposition or independent candidates, and 17% said that they would vote for government candidates. And in the final result, we got the ratios were 52 to 48. That is the total of all all non-government parties, including Alianza Democrática, Fuerza Vecinal, and all of those, was 52% out of the government, 48%. So we have a huge forecast errors, which frankly, right now, we don't know. I mean, as somebody who's analyzed polls a lot, I'm not sure how much of this is due to government tampering with the votes. So one hypothesis is, look, you don't have enough witnesses of the opposition, and therefore the government tampers with the votes. Or how much of it is due, for example, to things like much higher rates of emigration in pro-opposition districts. Because let's remember, when a pollster takes like a poll of 1,000 or 1,500 people nationwide, something that's really key is how do you weigh those persons to make sure that they're nationally representative? Well, if it turns out that and all of them, since there's been no census in Venezuela since 2011, all of them are using the 2011 census. But there's good evidence that emigration rates have been much, much higher in places that were seen as opposition strongholds. So anyway, it's complicated, but to make that type of predictions, which is the reason why I'm not going to make a prediction about the vote. I am going to make a prediction of something that I think is easier to predict given the experience, which is I predict that Elvis Amoroso is going to announce that Nicolás Maduro won the elections. And that's independent of how many votes come in. So then the question is, what do we get out of that? I mean, what is going to be the political scenario that unfolds out of it? And I think that there is a scenario where the perception, the belief that Maduro is blatantly stealing the election is going to lead to mass demonstration, is going to lead to confrontations in the streets, and is going to lead to a collapse of the regime. I think that scenario is possible and should be taken into account. The only thing is, I don't give that scenario a very high probability because I don't see this moment as necessarily all that different from other moments in which the opposition was very highly mobilized and in which it had a high level of legitimacy.
Francisco, you froze for a second.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now again?
Yes.
Okay. I don't see this moment as being all that different from, say, 2019, when Guaido was recognized by 57 countries, where he had 70% approval ratings, and where there were very high levels of mobilization in the street. So in other words, I think that we can get, I would not call it a transition. I don't think that's a transition. I think that we can get a regime collapse, but I think that a regime collapse comes out of a scenario of confrontation. And the past experience with confrontation, and particularly the support that Maduro has gotten recently over the past 6 years in his confrontations with the opposition, leads me to cautiously predict that most likely Maduro will remain in power after that confrontation, but without invalidating the possibility that you might get a collapse. But I said I wouldn't call that a transition because that's not a transition. A transition would occur if Elvis Amoroso announces that Edmundo González won. Or if Elvis Amoroso announces that Maduro won, and then Maduro kind of calls the opposition and says, hey, you know, we need to reach an agreement here, and we need to reach some coexistence agreement, and then the opposition agrees, and you form a national unity government, and maybe you go to new elections or something like that. That is a transition. A transition is an agreement that is entered upon voluntarily by the parts, including the part that is ceding power. I don't think that we're likely to have a transition in Venezuela now, because I don't think that we have the political institutions necessary for the winners to give credible guarantees to the losers. Nor do I think that the opposition leadership right now is in the hands of people who can credibly make those guarantees because their preferences are well known in that sense. They come from more hardline portions of the opposition. And you know, they were elected by opposition voters in a primary process. So that's I'm not questioning their legitimacy, but I am saying that their political preferences make it difficult to give these guarantees. But most importantly, I think that we don't have the institutions in Venezuela that allow for those guarantees to become credible. So I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in November of last year, just after the Barbados Agreement, in which I presented my criticism of Barbados. It's called "Can Venezuela Chart a Path Out of Crisis?" And basically, my criticism of Barbados is that I think that elections don't generate a transition. Like South Africans didn't say, let's go to elections to generate a transition. South Africans reached an agreement on the type of government and the type of coexistence arrangements that included a guarantee that the loser of the election would be the vice president of the incoming government. And that coexistence agreement was an agreement that had as its endpoint the realization of elections. So unless you lower the stakes of power, unless you allow credible guarantees, not only to be promised and put on a piece of paper. I mean, some people think that a credible guarantee is putting Maduro on a plane and giving him like 50 or 100 or $500 million or whatever. And that might be a guarantee, but it's not credible. And I don't think that that's how it works. I mean, it really, a guarantee has to be more a guarantee of coexistence, which lends me, brings me back a bit to the point on what happens if we do have a transition or a regime collapse, what happens the day after. And my view of this, I mean, I could devote a significant amount of time to talking about the economic policies and the role, and I agree with José Ignacio about the role of restoring the working of markets and restoring and emphasizing state capacity. I think that we need both state capacity and state autonomy. I think that one of the tragedies of Venezuela and many Latin American states is that even when they do have some capabilities, they're not autonomous from elites. And I think that distinguishes them, for example, from East Asian states. But I think that that unless we have institutions that lower the stakes of power, it's going to be very difficult for a democracy to emerge in Venezuela. I mean, we have to remember, we have a country whose constitution allows a popular president, say a recently elected president, to convene an all-powerful constitutional assembly that can dissolve other branches of government. So that means that you might have an electoral democracy, but you do not have a liberal democracy. You do not have separation of powers in Venezuela. You have an executive that can essentially go to the Supreme Court and say, if I don't like what you're doing, I'll fire you. And that's true regardless of whether the president is Hugo Chavez, is Nicolas Maduro, is Edmundo González, is María Corina Machado. So I think that as long as we have that type of authority in the government, then it's going to be the temptation for whoever's in power to use that to reinforce their capacity to stay in power is going to continue to be very high. And therefore, we're going to have a tendency towards having authoritarianism. So unless we enter into a deep reform of our political institutions so that lower the stakes of power and guarantee and protect the rights of minorities, and effectively do away with that kind of all-powerful executive that was created in the 1999 Constitution, then we might have, I mean, we could still have an effective government, but I don't think that we're going to have an effective democracy. Hello?
Perfect. So let's start taking some questions that I'm receiving here in the chat from the attendees. And the first one goes into the issue that I think both of you in different ways have mentioned, but particularly you, Jose Ignacio, which is the issue of transitional justice, and whether a law for transitional justice can be a framework strong enough to strengthen the possibility of a transition. And should the opposition make this proposal ahead of the election or not?
Yes, it should have been a serious, incredible proposal for a transitional justice system prior the election. I think that right now, to be honest, it's quite hard to imagine a scenario in which such a proposal can be built in just, I don't know, 6-7 weeks. But I have insisted on the necessity of a credible transitional plan as a necessary conditions to reduce the risk of a contentious elections. That basically is the scenario explained by Francisco. Regardless of the popular voting, Maduro is reelected in a very fraudulent and opaque ways, and that will end in a contentious election, in another lost opportunity for the country. So this is why I insisted in a transitional justice proposal, a credible one, once again, prior the election. And this is not only, by the way, from the opposition. I do not consider that the word opposition describes Venezuela. You have opposition in a democracy, but the situation in Venezuela is much more complex than an opposition trying to win an election. This is why I also suggested that the transitional justice system should be proposed by civil society, regardless of the particular convictions of everyone. That's a personal opinion, but there should have been a credible proposal embraced by civil society, embraced by human rights victims, that should be at the center of that proposal. Maybe it's too late to achieve that objective prior to the presidential elections. In any case, I will be insisting on that solution, because I absolutely believe that such a credible transitional justice plan will reduce the likelihood of another contentious election that will aggravate the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and its regional consequences.
Thank you very much, Jose Ignacio. Francisco, there is some questions, or there are several questions actually, in regards to whether Maduro might be able to restructure Venezuelan PDVSA's debt, whether he would do so within the IMF framework, what sort of incentives might he have to do so, and what timetable would you expect for such a process under either Maduro or the opposition?
Yes, well, I mean, I think that the answers are very different in the case of Maduro or the opposition. And as we know, there's a restructuring cannot happen unless the U.S. gives a green light, and the U.S. needs to give a green light either by lifting the financial sanctions imposed in August of 2017, or the way that I think it might happen under Maduro is essentially is a replay of or following the model of the Chevron negotiations. That is, creditors essentially say to OFAC, maybe the Venezuela Creditors Committee says to OFAC, hey, we want to go down to Caracas and we want to talk with the Maduro government about a potential for restructuring the debt. I'm talking about, post-elections, post-28th of July, Maduro is still in power. And of course, that also in itself implies different political scenarios. But let's suppose that he's able to consolidate himself in power and the grudging acceptance that they have to deal with Maduro. Then OFAC may allow negotiations between the VCC and the Maduro regime, which would then come with a proposal. And then OFAC might issue a specific, or it may end up being a general license, like General License 41, but tailored in order to make that to allow that restructuring to take place. Of course, for that, it's also a necessary condition to have, if it's Maduro, to have Maduro recognized by the U.S. government. And I think that at least in a scenario in which the Biden administration continues in office, and you don't have a very high level of political conflict around the elections, and that's a very big if. I think that we may enter a situation where the Biden administration decides that it's going to recognize Maduro, and we have to remember that there's no law that says that the president of the U.S. has to publicly announce that he recognizes another government or the head of another government. And definitely there's no law saying that he has to congratulate him or anything like that. The U.S. Essentially can formalize recognition. First of all, the doctrine that has been adopted by and large by European states and also by the U.S. is the doctrine of recognizing states, not governments. That was a doctrine that was to a certain extent broken by the Trump administration when it recognized Guaido. So I think that the Biden administration could, at some moment, be willing to present this rationale of, look, we need to reopen an embassy in Caracas. And in order to do that, we need to have some interaction with the Maduro government. Among other things, we need to continue having it in terms of addressing migration problems. And with that, reestablish recognition and then open the door to a restructuring. Of course, this is not going to happen if Maduro has the troops on the streets, like shooting hundreds of Venezuelan protesters. So that's why, or at least it's definitely not going to happen at that moment. That's why a lot of this depends on exactly how the political scenarios unfold. But I do think that under a scenario where Maduro consolidates himself in power and gets past this July 28th election, as he did in 2018, then the U.S. or a Biden administration might effectively consider engaging and opening up the route to addressing the problem of Venezuela and that restructuring. Now, the question actually that you want to ask there, if you enter that scenario, is why would Maduro want to restructure the debt? Because Maduro is willing to sign any sheet of paper with bondholders if that will give him legitimacy, if that will make him feel that he's recognized by these people who have offices in London and New York, then that's all positive for him. But the day that somebody explains to Maduro, look, right now you're paying bondholders zero, and once you restructure, you're going to have to start paying them something. Maybe it's $1 billion. $1 billion is a lot of money. I think that that's going to lead to a very complicated negotiation in which Maduro is going to essentially end up saying, in order to restructure the debt and in order to reach an agreement, you have to bring fresh money into Venezuela. Now, will that make sense for creditors? I think many creditors will say, fresh money into Venezuela? Forget about it. Let's just not think about this anymore. Perhaps some others will adopt a variant of this Chevron approach, which is, okay, if Maduro tells me that that if I put in fresh money, I will get recognized a high value or high recovery value of my debt, then I mean, we have to, there's something really interesting about the Chevron oil type oil restructurings, which is that Chevron has restructured its debt with zero haircuts, with zero face value haircuts. So it does make sense at some level. It's almost like playing Maduro's game and saying, yeah, I mean, I'll give you fresh money if you pay me back 100 instead of 30 cents on the dollar. So I think that we might enter that game. It's not going to be a very good restructuring for Venezuela, let's say. I mean, it's not, I don't think that it's going to solve Venezuela's debt problem in a stable way. Other scenario, let's because there are many different scenarios here in the middle, but let's think about well, I mean, there's a question about IMF. I don't see the IMF giving money to Venezuela under Maduro. I mean, recognition may allow him to get the special drawing rights. That's about it. I don't think that the IMF will even, because in the end, any type of IMF loan, even the ones that are in principle accessible without conditionality, has to be approved by, it has to be, as a matter of practice, signed off on by the US. And I think that's not going to happen I mean, unless Maduro were to win the elections in a clean and free and fair way, which doesn't really look like it's going to look that way. If the opposition comes into power, or if we have a transition with a government that is recognized, which the US wants to support, yeah, then you would have a restructuring, probably with a lot of support of the US, as you would have had it if Juan Guaido had come into office in January of 2019. But I think that what I think that we might get in Venezuela, not now. I mean, I think that we'll either we can have a regime collapse and the opposition come into power. As I said, that's a possibility. We also have just status quo, which is what I've been describing in terms of restructuring, or we have at some moment another type of transition, a more negotiated transition, perhaps a transition where Maduro agrees to step down and somebody else takes the helm, perhaps a transition where some offer is made to the opposition, to certain opposition groups of participating in a national unity government. And again, that looks very distant now, but it looked distant, say, in 2008 to the MDC in Zimbabwe, and then they ended up entering into a national unity agreement, which didn't work very well for them. But there are other cases, such as that of the roundtable agreements, where it didn't work out badly for the opposition. So you have different scenarios of those, and I think, and I guess the point. Let me actually make even an additional point here. If we try to map out even an Edmundo González presidency that doesn't have a collapse of the outgoing regime, but that actually happens in an orderly way, then we're talking about Edmundo González dealing with the Chavista, with the Maduro-appointed Supreme Court, with the Maduro-appointed Prosecutor General, Controller General, with a National Assembly that at least for 1 year is going to be under the power of Chavismo. I think that there's going to be a really complex calculus where probably even in that scenario, there's going to be a lot of reticence to the IMF coming in strongly and saying, we're going to pour a lot of money into a Venezuela in which it's not even clear that Chavismo has really fully transferred power. Anyway, I mean, a lot of those scenarios are, there's a lot of subvariants of all of them, but bottom line is, I mean, I think that formally and legally, it will become possible. I don't see Venezuela restructuring its debt in a way that is conducive to long-term fiscal and economic sustainability, unless you get some more comprehensive political change, which for me has to do with change that addresses the building of the institutions necessary for a stable liberal democracy to be in place in Venezuela.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francisco. Jose Ignacio, on the issue of the different liabilities of Venezuela, which, we have arbitration claims, judgment creditors, and of course, the special case of Chevron, who seems to be a privileged creditor that is recovering without any haircut. One of the questions is, what's your opinion regarding these awarded creditors, where it arbitration claims or judgment creditors? Are they in a better position versus the rest of the bondholders or the creditors?
That's a great question, and it should be answered from a, let's say, legal perspective and from a pragmatical one. From a legal perspective, they should not be in a preferent position just because they have a judgment in his favor. The equal treatment principle, and this is something that I have deeply discussed with Lee Buchheit, cannot and should not be modified just because a creditor obtained a judgment. For instance, you are a bondholder and then you have a judgment, you are a arbitration award holder and then you have a judgment, and so on and on. So there should be no special treatment or preference regarding creditors with judgment, because otherwise, if you, the government, say, well, we're going to recognize special treatment to creditor judgment, well, that's a clear invitation to file claims. And by the way, I finished, and I expect to publish this very soon, I finished a comprehensive research on all the cases regarding Venezuela at the Southern District Court of New York since 2006 until last week. And still, there is a very lower number of claims at the Southern District Court of New York, that, as we all know, is the court deciding the debt issues in Venezuela, meaning that there's a lot of claims that could be raised, and I think will be raised before the court. So there should be no advantage. However, from a practical perspective, the story is absolutely different, because judgment creditors with the breed of attachment, as it is the case of the creditors waiting at Delaware, they have a, let's say, de facto preference, because they can push for the enforcement of their breed of attachment in case that a restructuring debt is not according to their interest. So I will say that the difference is not based on the existence of a judgment, but on a breed of attachment over the shares of PDV holding. By the way, because the auction sale of PDV holding shares is going in a very inefficient way, and as we all know, more than half of the creditors in any case will be able to collect their debts. I am expecting that some of those creditors will start chasing assets of Venezuela abroad. We have this strategy by Conoco that is trying now to enforce some of their judgments in Trinidad and Tobago regarding the gas project of Venezuela. And I mean, it doesn't make any sense thinking that you have a creditor such as Chevron that is receiving payment, exporting oil to the United States without facing any liabilities by creditors that will not be able to collect their debt. So what I am trying to explain here is that we have to pay attention to creditor spending in Delaware, because first, most of them will not be able to collect. And as a result, they will have all the incentive to try to seize other assets, as for instance, oil incomes derived from the new oil contracts executed under the individual license. Venezuela cannot export oil to the United States without facing the risk of claims, and I am expecting that is going to be the next chapter in the Venezuelan debt crisis, and the only solution is a comprehensive debt restructuring process that once again shouldn't consider any preference regarding creditors that have a judgment.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to take the last question, which is very brief, and then I'll ask each of you to give us a little bit of a summary of what we have discussed here and your perspective. The last question we are taking is if the Biden administration should be expected to reimpose tougher sanctions on Venezuela and its oil industry, if they find that the upcoming election process does not meet the standard for legitimacy. Francisco?
Yes, well, yeah, I mean, I think that we can answer that question from a positive standpoint, that is a predictive one, or from a normative one, which is whether it should do it. And my answer would be probably not on both. I mean, I think that by and large, what we've seen is that the Biden administration has pursued this easing of sanctions, I think primarily driven by other considerations and primarily driven by its desire to get Venezuela to produce some more oil, and particularly and most importantly, to address the issues with migration at the border. And migration right now is a way more important political consideration in the U.S. in terms of its electoral impact than Venezuelan democracy or the lack of democracy in Venezuela. So I don't see the Biden administration doing it. I'll extend the answer to would a Trump administration do it? And I think that there the answer is we don't know either, because the Trump administration might be very different from the first Trump administration. Among other things, Donald Trump has put a lot of emphasis on having as an important foreign policy goal, bringing the Russia-Ukraine war to an end. And I think that that will be done in a context that would be done in a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, in a context of rapprochement with Russia. So I think that there, most likely the U.S. is not going to want to antagonize Russia in that understanding. I mean, given that reaching of a peace deal in Ukraine. I mean, we might be looking at a scenario where Russia and the U.S. actually become allies. And if not, there won't be any the U.S. won't be looking to antagonize Russia. So again, this is, I want to emphasize, this is a possible scenario with Trump. I do think that we can also get another scenario, which is the return to maximum pressure. I just want to highlight that even that is not guaranteed in a second Trump administration. From a normative standpoint, that is, should the Biden administration do it? Well, I mean, first of all, I think that it's really important to point something out that sometimes people forget, which is that the U.S. is the only country that has imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry. The U.S. is the only country that has imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela. And Europe has been very firm with respect to this. They impose personal sanctions. They impose sanctions on regime officials and persons associated with them, but not on the Venezuelan economy for good reason, because they don't want to make things more difficult for Venezuelans. And I think that there is strong evidence, not just in the Venezuelan case, there is overwhelming evidence that sanctions have strong negative consequences on living conditions in countries that are targeted by sanctions. I published a literature study, a survey in the Journal of Economic Studies last year, which found that out of 31 quantitative studies, 30 of them find that there are adverse effects on living conditions from the imposition of sanctions, ranging from large effects on GDP, on life expectancy, even on deterioration of human rights. So I think that there's a very strong normative case that the U.S., like Europe and like other civilized countries, should have personal sanctions, should have smart sanctions in its arsenal, should not have dumb sanctions. Dumb sanctions are the opposite of smart sanctions. They're the sanctions that are aimed at and target the functioning of the economies, and they generate significant collateral damage on people who cannot, by any stretch of the imagination, be said to be accountable and be held accountable for the crimes of those who rule over them.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Jose Ignacio, just to allow you, because you spoke quite a bit on the sanctions regime and OFAC and so on as well. What's your view on what the Biden administration could do should the election process not meet the standards for legitimacy?
Well, if Maduro is reelected in any scenario, meaning if the electoral authority in Venezuela proclaim Maduro as a reelected president, as I explained, that election will not be considered a credible a ballot. It will be a contentious election. And the United States, the executive, the presidency will not have any other option than to challenge that election, which means there's not going to be any immediate possibility to improve the foreign relations with Venezuela. And I will add that this will depend not only on the presidency, whether it's Biden or Trump. We also have to consider that in the United States politics, the Senate, the Congress, has a strong position in foreign relations. And there is in the few areas in which I will say there is a bipartisan agreement is precisely regarding Venezuela. So from a technical perspective, I am not trying to reflect my personal opinion here. Please bear on me on that. And a scenario in which Maduro is reelected is a scenario in which the Venezuelan crisis will continue. And it will be very unlikely that Venezuela will be able to fully resume its international relations with the United States, with multilateral institutions, which is a necessary condition to solve the debt problem and solve all the institutional problems that Venezuela has. That is another topic that is recognition, is more complex one, is a legal topic, too hard to explain in short minutes, but in any case, from the perspective of the United States policy towards Venezuela, I highly doubt that in a case of a re-election by Maduro, the United States government will move towards a normalization with Venezuela, which is, of course, bad news, taking into consideration the current affairs in the country.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Jose Ignacio. We are on the last few minutes of this webinar, which I think has been fantastic. Each of you have shared your thoughts, gone into deep detail, and share your. I would like Jose Ignacio to spend, and then Francisco to maybe spend 2 to 3 minutes, maybe raising some final points or a summary of your thoughts, just for the benefit of the audience, and that will end this webinar. Jose Ignacio.
Thank you. I will summarize my impressions on the Citgo situation. Citgo is not lost yet, and there is still a long process ahead. The Delaware court adopted, which I consider from a legal perspective, some inefficient decisions. For instance, in the way through which the Delaware court defined the priority order, that is not first in, first served, but a sort of first in, first out based on an arbitrary selection by the Delaware court. And as a result of this, and we have to add another layer of complexity, which is the 2020. As we all know, the 2020 case is pending before the Second Circuit. That is taking too much time. Therefore, I am expecting some news and unexpected decisions back there. But in any case, because the special master decided to include in some way or the other the 2020s in the whole negotiation. That will create another layer of complexity. And this is why, in terms of losing Citgo, in terms of transfer of PDV holding shares, there is no immediate risk. And I define immediate, let's say that in the next 6, maybe 12 months, Citgo will still be there, which mean, and I will stop here, a very important consequences. Whoever the president of Venezuela will be on January the 10th, that person will have enough time to try to avoid an inefficient solution regarding Citgo. However, the capability of that new government will depend on the outcome of the election schedule for July 28th. And as I have been saying, any scenario in which Maduro is proclaimed president will not favor the capability, recognition of the new Venezuelan government to deal with the root cause of the Citgo crisis, which is, as we all know, the legacy external debt of Venezuela. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoy this conversation.
Well, Francisco, please share with us any final thoughts or ideas in the next, 2-3 minutes or so. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you, Jorge. Thanks, José Ignacio, and to everybody who posed questions. This has been a very stimulating conversation. I think thinking forward, it's important for a lot of us who are invested in many different ways in Venezuela to think to July 29th and to think about what are the decisions, what are the choices that are going to be taken at that moment, and what they're going to mean for the future of Venezuela. I, much as in this room, would like to see Venezuela's dictatorship, the Maduro dictatorship, come to an end. I consider it a heinous authoritarian regime. I also believe that there's a difference between what one wishes and what one can attain. And I think that we have a reality of a regime that has a very strong grip on power, but we also have the reality of a political conflict in Venezuela, which has become, by all means, essentially intractable. So I think that one of the challenges is, how do we not repeat the 2019 to 2024 scenario? Because if what we get out of this situation is one in which the solution is, well, let's impose sanctions on the Venezuelan economy again, let's isolate the government, let's deny it international recognition, let's recognize another government in its place, and if we already know that story, and I think it doesn't lead us to a good place. It might seem like the right thing to do, but it doesn't lead us to a good place. So I think that there are more fundamental issues in Venezuela which have to do with the country's institutional arrangements, with the inability of those institutional arrangements in the midst of the country's deep polarization to offer guarantees for peaceful coexistence. And I think that and I understand, and many people believe as a matter of principle that we shouldn't be thinking about peaceful coexistence with the people who run the Maduro regime. But I would ask them, what exactly is the alternative? And how do we avoid our country continue being trapped in a conflict, which, by the way, can get much worse? Because although Venezuela has seen a dramatic economic collapse, Venezuela has not descended into the levels of violence that characterize other conflicts. And I think that we have to find ways to step back from that brink. And I think that means accepting the need for coexisting. And it's very easy to coexist with the people whom you like. The challenge is to coexist with those whom you don't like. I think unless we accept that challenge and we take seriously the need to rebuild the institutions for that, then we run a severe risk of the country not only maintaining itself in the current conflict, but spiraling into a conflict that is even darker than the one that we have seen.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. It has been truly a real treat to have this conversation with such a group of accomplished professionals here. I think it has been very enriching for all of us and for the audience, which has kept its participation throughout the extended period, well over an hour, almost reaching an hour and a half. So I want to thank you and everybody that has participated, and hopefully we can have another event soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you.
Bye-bye.